Happy New Year and welcome to 2026. This year marks the centennial, the 100th anniversary of the Mother Road, Route 66, bringing car travel coast to coast across the United States and through the Southwest. So today I wanted to tell you the story of the first automobile trip to the Grand Canyon that happened nearly 20 years before the Mother Road was born. It started on September 17th, 1901, when the first train reached the south rim of the Grand Canyon. Just 4 months later, in January of 1902, an automobile would attempt the same journey. Departing from Flagstaff, nearly 70 miles away, what was expected to be a trip of only a few hours instead became a grueling test of endurance, one that echoed a familiar theme in Grand Canyon history: optimism colliding with the realities of the landscape. Travel to the area had truly begun in the 1890s when word of the canyon's beauty was spread around the world. But access to the rim was anything but easy. At the time, intrepid stagecoach drivers across northern Arizona began transporting the region's first tourists, threading rough roads through forests, plateaus, and deserts. For nearly a decade, the stagecoach remained the premier way to reach the rim. The journey could take 12 hours or more, often stretched across 2 to 3 exhausting days. But for early travelers, it was the only realistic path to one of the most awe-inspiring sights in the American Southwest. You just had to ride the railroad to Arizona, then hire a stagecoach driver for the long, bone-rattling journey to the edge of the canyon. Starting from Flagstaff, Williams, and Peach Springs, drivers competed to haul visitors from the train line over these rough roads to the canyon. The Flagstaff to Grand Canyon line held one major advantage. It was the only route officially endorsed by the Santa Fe Railroad, and it passed through some of the most scenic country in northern Arizona. So for years, it remained the most popular path to the rim. Then everything changed. In 1901, the railroad completed the Grand Canyon spur line. Once trains could roll directly to the south rim, the stage lines collapsed almost overnight, relics of a disappearing era. At the same moment, a new invention was rolling out of factories and onto American roads: the automobile. The dream of driving to the Grand Canyon began with a man named Samuel E. Farraut. With the end of the stagecoach era clearly on the horizon, Farraut took a bold new approach. In July of 1900, he announced that he would launch an automobile stage line instead. If Flagstaff residents would pledge to buy 100 advanced round-trip tickets at $10 each, Farraut promised he would go back east, purchase an automobile, bring it to Flagstaff, and give it a test run all the way to the Grand Canyon. Farraut followed through. He ordered a car from Haynes Apperson, equipped with a 12-horsepower engine and capable of carrying 7 passengers. It was custom built for mountain roads, and the company even promised to send a factory mechanic west with the car to help assemble it and guide Farraut through the first test drive to the canyon. Farraut believed the entire journey could be done in 8 hours, maybe even 6. So the automobile was scheduled to arrive in early October, and the historic test run would begin immediately afterwards. While waiting for the automobile to arrive and be assembled, Farraut continued preparing the road to the canyon. Rather than relying on existing stage roads, he hired local guide Al Doyle to cut an entirely new path, one designed specifically for automobiles. Doyle spent the summer building a shorter, smoother road that Farraut hoped would give his new auto stage line a real advantage. When the car finally reached Flagstaff, Farraut proudly took locals on test drives around town. But the excitement didn't last. The Haynes Apperson factory had failed to send the promised mechanic, and without him, Farraut couldn't risk the long run to the canyon. After the first joyrides, he parked the automobile in George Babbitt's garage and waited. Unfortunately, the mechanic didn't arrive until mid-November, and by then it was far too late. Winter was settling in across northern Arizona, and no one was about to attempt a 70-mile mountain drive in freezing weather. Farraut and the automobile headed south to Phoenix for the winter. But when they returned in the spring, something had changed. Farraut's enthusiasm for the auto stage idea had cooled. The Santa Fe Railroad had originally supported his plan, but at the time, they did not own the Grand Canyon Railway. That changed over the winter. The Grand Canyon Railway fell into financial trouble, creditors had seized control, and in July of 1901, the Santa Fe Railroad purchased the struggling line. With the acquisition, everything shifted. Santa Fe's priority was no longer an auto route from Flagstaff, it was finishing the last 10 miles of train tracks straight to the rim. By September 1901, the Grand Canyon line was complete, trains reached Grand Canyon Village for the first time, and Flagstaff's dream of their gateway to the Grand Canyon status was fading fast. By November, Farote packed up, left Flagstaff, and relocated entirely out to California. His auto stage venture ended before it ever truly began. Photographer and automobile enthusiast Oliver Lippincott would soon pick up where Farote left off. In the summer of 1900, Lippincott had already made history as the first person to drive an automobile into Yosemite Valley. The following year, he began laying the groundwork for a far more ambitious challenge. The car, often called a machine in those days, was a Toledo steam automobile. Powered by a gasoline-fired coil boiler, its compact little steam engine produced 10 horsepower. The main car seated 2 passengers comfortably, and with an attached trailer, it could haul 2 more, along with luggage, tools, and fuel. To produce its steam to power the engine, the Toledo could carry up to 30 gallons of fuel and 57 gallons of water. A strange-looking machine by today's standards, but this ungainly contraption would become the first automobile to reach the rim of the canyon. The American Bicycle Company, which owned the Toledo brand, built this particular vehicle specifically for Lippincott and sponsored the entire stunt. They intended to prove, very publicly, just how tough and reliable their machines were. Weighing around 2,200 pounds and capable of top speeds of about 42 miles per hour, newspaper ads bragged that the Toledo was unstoppable, not to be hindered by mud, snow, or ice. If Lippincott's Grand Canyon run succeeded, the company planned to send 3 more large 15-passenger motor coaches to Flagstaff, establishing the very auto tour business that Farote had first imagined. A brief aside, you'll notice the Flagstaff papers repeatedly describe the Toledo's fuel as oil, though they were almost certainly referring to early gasoline. Easy enough to mix up in a frontier town like Flagstaff, which in 1902 had seen only a handful of automobiles. But that little confusion, oil versus gas, would come back to haunt the crew in a very real way on their journey to the Grand Canyon. Speaking of newspapers, along with Lippincott were 2 other California reporters sent to document the journey. The first was Winfield Clark Hogeboom. Born in New York, Hogeboom grew up around the printing trade. His father manufactured paper, and Winfield naturally gravitated towards the newspaper world. He spent 12 years with the Associated Press, eventually owning and editing papers in South Dakota and later in California. His work with the AP made him widely known in journalistic circles across the state, and he later served as editor of the Los Angeles Herald. Hogeboom would become the lively, humorous voice behind the most famous account of this trip. Along with Hogeboom was Thomas M. Chapman, the former editor of the Tonawanda Herald in New York. Chapman had moved west after a very public dispute ended with him punching a preacher. Out in California, he resumed his career in journalism, and like Hogeboom, he was assigned to accompany Lippincott to record the events of this experimental automobile run to the Grand Canyon. The men had originally planned to make the journey as a trio, but once they arrived in Flagstaff, they met up with Al Doyle, who had spent the previous summer cutting a brand new road towards the canyon, and he would describe it like this. After you get over the rise just outside of town, you strike down through Fort Valley, then bear off to the west, but don't get too far up into the foothills while you're skirting the peaks. Hit the new trail and cross the Big Wash. Pretty soon, you'll get into the trees. Dry Tanks is about 4 miles east of you, and after you pass Sheep Ranch and come up out of the gulch, turn east again until you reach the clearing. The trail goes straight into Moody Spawn Cabin. From there, head back into the trees until you come to Red Mountain. Then take off across the desert and follow the old sheep trail until you reach the mouth of Red Horse Canyon. Just left of the Dog Knobs, you'll hit the Cedars again. Keep right on the old trail until you get to Skinner's cabin. Then bear down the gulch to the right and follow it. After you strike the old trail back of Red Buttes, follow it right on into Barry's. It was the kind of frontier navigation that made perfect sense to the man who had built the road, but sounded like pure wilderness nonsense to everyone else. And after hearing Doyle's directions, they quickly realized they needed him along for the trip. So the trio became a quartet, and Doyle climbed aboard for luck. After years of buildup, the moment had finally arrived. The road, the machine, the men all came together in early 1902. And at 2:10 p.m. on Saturday, January 4th, the little Toledo automobile chugged out of Flagstaff on its historic run to the Grand Canyon. The people of Flagstaff turned out in force to witness the departure. Some cheered, some laughed, many placed bets, giving the crew anywhere from 6 days to 6 years to complete the trip. But Lippincott and his team were confident, too confident. Believing the journey would only take a few hours, they packed almost no extra food and very little water, a decision they would soon regret. The machine worked splendidly, at least until the group was safely out of sight of the excited crowd. That's when Lippincott admitted that the trailer was bearing down too heavily on the rear axle. The weight distribution was all wrong. They had to stop, unload everything, reshuffle the luggage, and even reposition themselves to balance the load. By the time they had finished the awkward repacking and climbing back aboard, daylight was already fading. With night settling in around them, the little Toledo rolled forward again, chugging straight into the vast, shadowy expanse of the Coconino Forest. Hogaboom later described the night run into the Coconino Forest like this. There is no underbrush, no small trees, just giant pines shooting straight into the sky. The ground was smooth and hard, carpeted with pine needles. It was dark under those towering branches, with only a faint trickle of light slipping through. But we couldn't stop for the darkness. We sped on and on. It was bitterly cold, especially for thin-blooded Californians. And after 2 hours of pushing through the forest, Doyle finally called for a halt. A rough stretch of country lay ahead, and he insisted it would be safer to face it in daylight. The decision disappointed everyone. They had confidently promised the people of Flagstaff they would reach the Grand Canyon that very night, and believed it themselves. So much so that they brought no food, no provisions, and no plan for stopping. As Hogaboom put it, it is one thing to say you're going to run an automobile through a wild, uninhabited country at night when the moon is off duty, and another thing to actually do it. Nearby, the men spotted a faint side trail climbing the slope of a small mountain. Doyle reckoned that Moody Spawn's cabin was somewhere up there, so they left the automobile behind and made the climb on foot. Another quick sidebar, Hogaboom refers to this place as Moody Spawn's cabin. But when a Flagstaff paper reprinted the tale, they revised the name to Murderbach's cabin. And that correction makes sense. Gustav Murderbach was a real rancher in this area, and it seems the locals recognized the spot better than Hogaboom did in the dark. Today, Murderbach's tank lies just east of Kendrick Peak, and using Farot's 1900 road map, I've overlaid the old route onto a modern map to narrow down where this cabin probably stood. So following the trail, they expected to find nothing more than an empty shelter, just a place to get out of the cold. However, as they approached the cabin, they saw light glowing through the cracks. To their surprise, 3 cowboys were staying there. The cabin was usually deserted, but that night it was alive with company and full of cowboy hospitality. The cowboys had recently butchered a 2-year-old steer, and their supplies included flour, baking powder, coffee, honey, and even ice hauled in from nearby lava tube caves. The crew bunked with them on the cabin floor, grateful for the warmth, food, and friendly faces in the middle of the dark forest. Long before daylight, they were awake again. After a breakfast of coffee, biscuits, honey, and fresh steaks, they hiked back down the mountain and returned to the automobile just as dawn was breaking. The night had been bitterly cold, and by morning, the automobile was frozen solid. It took a long time to thaw out the machine, and they burned through a valuable portion of their fuel doing so. But the men weren't concerned. They were certain they would reach Barry's place on the rim by 2 o'clock, and surely, this journey wouldn't take more than 24 hours. The cowboys from Murderbox Cabin rode out to see them off, mounted on fiery broncos that snorted and danced every time the Toledo's cylinders puffed a burst of steam. For the next 10 miles, the little machine rolled effortlessly through the forest. It was a glorious morning and a glorious ride. When they emerged from the pines onto the open plateau, the going got even better. They passed bands of antelope and wild horses grazing in the high desert. The level ground tempted Lippincott to open the throttle and give the Toledo a little extra steam, but that's when something popped. The water gauge had burst. The valves refused to work, and suddenly they had no steam at all and no hope. Unfortunately, this was only the beginning of their troubles that day. They had already used up the gasoline they had brought from Los Angeles and were forced to refuel using the fuel purchased in Flagstaff. It was supposed to be gasoline, it wasn't. The confusion between gasoline and oil had come back to haunt them, and this fuel wasn't going to get them far. The moment they fired up the boiler again, it became obvious that this gasoline couldn't produce enough heat to keep the steam pressure up. The Toledo limped forward, crawling along at barely 3 miles an hour. January days in northern Arizona are incredibly short, and after a long string of breakdowns and delays, it was clear they wouldn't reach the canyon rim before sundown. Desperate for progress, they made a hard choice. Abandon the trailer, along with its load of baggage, extra water, and the worthless fuel. Everything not absolutely essential was left behind in the desert. All 4 men piled onto the little machine in a heap, and once again, the Toledo sprang to life. For about a mile, it ran beautifully. Then came a sharp metallic click, followed by a harsh, rasping grind. The sprocket chain had broke. Now stranded out on the open plain, the men spent 3 hours in the freezing dark trying to repair the broken chain. By midnight, the car was drivable again, but just barely. 2 men rode the machine, while the other 2 walked ahead, guided only by the Toledo's fading headlights, which grew dimmer and dimmer with every minute as the last of their kerosene burned away. Their only hope was to reach a distant strand of cedar trees Doyle remembered. If they could just make it there, they could at least gather wood and build a fire. They reached the cedars sometime around midnight and scraped together a pair of small campfires. The night that followed was miserable. None of them truly slept. It became a constant battle between freezing and feeding the fire. Drift off for a moment, wake up shivering, throw on more wood, and repeat. For breakfast, each man simply looked at the automobile and had a smoke. No one said a word about being hungry or even thirsty. At the bottom of the water tank, they found a little dirty ice, melted it, tried to drink it, but it wasn't much. A quick inspection of the machine revealed the grim truth. Only a small amount of the bad gasoline remained in the tanks, and just a little water in the boiler. Doyle estimated it was still about 18 miles to Pete Barry's place on the rim. Not that it really mattered anymore. At this point, only Lippincott still cared about the machine. He drove while the rest of the group walked ahead through the cold. After only 2 miles, even Lippincott had reached his limit. The Toledo was finally abandoned where it sat. The men pressed on foot through rising terrain, climbing gradually until the land returned to the tall, quiet ponderosa pine forest. By now, they had stripped off anything that added weight and trudged forward in exhausted silence. 18 miles isn't such a long walk under normal circumstances, but they were hungry, thirsty, and weak from 2 nights without real sleep. Around noon, they spotted Skinner's cabin, a lonely log structure with a local legend that some fellow named Skinner had built it years ago. Tacked on the front of the cabin was a hand-painted sign. 6 3/8 miles to the Grand Canyon. Looking on maps today, about 6 miles straight south of Grandview Point is a feature called Skinner's Ridge, which you can also see present on Farot's 1900 map. My best guess is that Skinner's cabin was around this area, and while it may have been 6 3/8 miles to Grand Canyon as the crow flies, covering that distance on foot was a whole other story. Skinner's cabin marked a breaking point. 2 of the members of the party, chauffeur Lippincott and journalist Thomas Chapman, they were completely spent. they could go no further. Doyle and Hogaboom agreed to push ahead the remaining distance to Barry's and send a relief party back for the others. Desperate, dehydrated, and half delirious, the group split up. 2 men pushing onward, 2 left behind to wait for rescue. They hadn't gone far, though, before Doyle faltered. His stomach, as Hogaboom put it, wasn't acting right. Here, he left Doyle behind among the lava rocks, wrestling with his rebellious stomach, and Hogaboom pushed on alone. After trudging another 8 miles, his thoughts drifted back to the sign on Skinner's cabin. 6 3/8 miles to the Grand Canyon. Why, he wondered, did the man have to be so exact? If the sign marker had lied with round numbers, 6 miles or even about 7 miles, Hogaboom could have forgiven him. But to be confoundedly exact when the distance was clearly not an inch less than 12 miles and likely closer to 14, that was enough to make a starving, dehydrated man furious. Hogaboom vowed then and there that if it took him half a lifetime, he would find the man who put up the sign and kill him without mercy. That fury kept him moving forward. Eventually, Hogaboom spotted a deer up ahead, pawing at a small patch of snow. Desperate and nearly delirious with thirst, he rushed towards it and dropped to his knees, eating as much snow as he could before stuffing his pockets full. To him, the taste was heavenly. The snow tasted better than the most delicious ice cream he had ever eaten. It was not very clean. The deer had trampled all over it, but he didn't mind. Revived, he pushed onward. About 5 o'clock, Hogaboom noticed a break in the trees, and then suddenly he stepped onto the edge of the grandest, most awe-inspiring sight in the world, the Grand Canyon of the Colorado. He later wrote, "I stood there upon the rim of the tremendous chasm and forgot who I was and what I came there for. Before me lay the sublimest panorama in the world. Nature never made anything like it anywhere else. It is the great masterpiece. And as I viewed it, and my eyes drank in the grandeur of the scene, I said to myself, you better stand back a little further, you might fall in." Exhausted, starving, half delirious but alive, Hogaboom had reached the rim at last. 20 minutes later, Hogaboom reached Grandview Hotel, where landlord Pete Barry immediately asked what he needed. Hogaboom said, "All I want is water, food, and the address of the man who put up a sign on Skinner's cabin." They brought him a little water and a can of tomatoes, but refused to give him the name of whoever made that sign. That night, around 8 o'clock, Barry set out with a 4-horse relief team, bringing back Lippincott, Chapman, and Doyle. By 9 o'clock, the reunited party ate enough dinner to give any landlord but Pete Barry a nervous breakdown, and by 10 o'clock, they were sound asleep. The next day, Barry and Hogaboom traveled over to Bright Angel Hotel, where they telephoned for more gasoline. The following day, the fuel arrived by train, and on the day after that, Thursday, January 7th, they managed to bring the abandoned automobile all the way to the Grand Canyon. At last, the car itself had finally reached the rim. It had taken 5 days, 4 men, and an untold amount of frustration, cold, and mechanical misery. Proud of their accomplishments, they decided to take one final risk. Lippincott carefully drove the Toledo right up to the edge of the Grand Canyon. There, he photographed the little steam car staring out over the vastness of the canyon, the first automobile ever to reach its rim. On Saturday morning, before daylight, Doyle, Chapman, Hogaboom, they all rode over to Apex on the train line, 16 miles from Grandview Point, and from there they caught the train home. They all regretted that they couldn't make the return trip by automobile, but they were already long overdue and had to get back as quickly as possible. Several days later, however, Lippincott did make the return journey by car. He drove the Toledo all the way from Grandview Hotel back to Flagstaff, about 67 miles in just under 7 hours. Newspapers predicted that an automobile line would surely be established by the next summer. It was, they claimed, the best, indeed the only, scenic route for future sightseers. The country was rich with natural attractions, and the scenery and climate were superb. Optimism was high. The age of automobile travel to the Grand Canyon had begun, or so they believed. Like many great adventures, this one was simply ahead of its time. Lippincott's journey made for an unforgettable tale of grit, breakdowns, and near disasters, but it didn't exactly support the idea that an automobile travel to the Grand Canyon would be easy. In 1902, train travel was still king, and the brand new Grand Canyon Railway offered the fastest, smoothest, and most comfortable route to the South Rim. But the idea wouldn't die. Over the next decade, the old stagecoach roads began evolving into something new. Those dusty wagon trails slowly knit themselves into the National Old Trails Road, a coast-to-coast automobile route stretching from Washington, D.C. to Los Angeles, California. In Arizona, it followed the Santa Fe Railroad corridor, the same path that would later be transformed into the legendary Mother Road. By the mid-1920s, the automobile was no longer a curiosity, but becoming a way of life. And in 1926, U.S. Route 66 was officially born. As cars improved and roads expanded, the ease of automobile travel finally surpassed the old railroad connections. Over 100 years later, brothers Nick and Chris Howell recreated this historic first trip by driving their own Toledo steam car from Flagstaff to Grandview Point in 2014. They still own this car and have it in England where they occasionally take it for a drive. So I would like to thank the Howell brothers and Grand Canyon historian Tom Martin for sharing some photos of this adventure. I hope you all enjoyed this look at a piece of Grand Canyon and Route 66 history. Stay tuned for part 2, where we trace how Route 66 and the rise of automobile tourism shaped the Grand Canyon and the national parks.